The Petrohan Pass cuts through the western slopes of the Balkan Mountains in the northwestern part of Bulgaria, a country in Eastern Europe where dense forests, steep ridgelines, and long winters still shape the rhythm of life. In February, the mountains are quiet. Snow settles deep across the terrain, softening the sharp edges of rock and trail. Pine and beech forests stretch across the slopes, broken only by narrow roads that wind through the pass, connecting small villages scattered across the region. The air is cold, still, and often heavy with fog that rolls in without warning, reducing visibility to almost nothing. It is a place that feels remote, not untouched, but distant enough that what happens there can go unnoticed for longer than it should. A region known not only for its landscape, but for its problems. Illegal logging has been a persistent issue for years. Entire sections of forest disappear quietly, cut down without permits, and transported out before authorities can respond. Poaching is another concern. Animals hunted outside of regulated seasons, often deep in areas where oversight is limited. And because of its geography, Petrohan sits close to something else: the border with Serbia, another Balkan country to the west of Bulgaria. That proximity has long made the region a corridor, not just for movement, but for activities that prefer to remain unseen. Routes pass through terrain like this because it is difficult to monitor and easier to disappear into. But there was also something unusual about one particular place in those mountains: the Petrohan Hut. For decades, it had been what mountain huts are meant to be: a public refuge, a place where hikers could stop, rest, sleep, and continue on their way. Trails passed freely through the area. People came and went without restriction. Then, at some point in the years before the events of 2026, that changed. The hut was purchased by one person, Ivalo Kalashev. After that, according to locals and people familiar with the area, the atmosphere shifted. Access became less open. Some of the paths around the hut were restricted. Barriers appeared. Chains were placed across routes that had once been freely used. Cameras were installed, and the people who lived there were not always welcoming. Some who passed through described them as organized, disciplined, even professional. Others described them as hostile and suspicious of outsiders, unwilling to explain who they were or what they were doing there. No one could quite agree on what the group actually was. They called themselves rangers, yet they were not officially recognized. Some believed they were genuinely trying to protect the forest, stopping illegal logging, preventing poaching, doing work that authorities often struggled to maintain in such remote terrain. But others weren't so sure, because these people's presence raised more questions than answers. What exactly were they doing there? Where did their funding come from? Why did they have equipment that seemed far beyond what a typical volunteer group would need? And why did they behave as if they had authority over land that wasn't theirs? The hut, once a public refuge, had become something else. A base. For what exactly? No one could say with certainty. And then in February of 2026, something happened there that forced the entire country to start asking those questions out loud. Within days, it would be described by the highest-ranking prosecutor in Bulgaria as a real-life Twin Peaks, a place where nothing is quite what it seems, where timelines fracture, where people disappear, and where every answer only leads to more questions. It began with a fire. The first detailed account of what had happened did not come from investigators. It came from the mayor of a nearby village. He was among the first to reach the site after the fire, and what he described did not sound like an accident. The hut had burned through the night, but not completely. Parts of the structure were still standing, blackened and unstable, the air still heavy with smoke. The snow around it, fresh and undisturbed in most places, had been broken by debris. Burned wood, dark fragments scattered outward from the building. And right outside the hut laid 3 bodies, positioned next to each other, each with a gunshot wound to the head. When the mayor spoke for the TV cameras in a morning broadcast, certain details stood out. He mentioned the bodies were dressed in burned clothing. Their bodies had marks, blood covering their hands, signs that something had happened before the fire. Not after, but it was something else he said that changed the scale of the situation entirely. There were people at the scene who were not just police, people for national security. At that point, no official explanation had been given for their presence. And that detail spread quickly, because it suggested that whatever had happened at the Petrohan Hut might not be so trivial. Within hours, the story had everyone's attention. 3 men dead in the mountains, a burned hut, gunshot wounds, national security on site. The questions came immediately. Were they killed? Did they kill themselves? What were they doing there? And perhaps most importantly, who were they? At first, there were no names, no identities released, only fragments. But as journalists, independent investigators, and people online began to dig, information started to surface. And what they found made the story far more complicated, because the men were not random hikers. They belonged to an organization, a group that had been living and operating in that exact location, in that hut for some time. A group that called themselves something very specific. Rangers, not officially, not as part of any recognized state structure, but according to people who had encountered them, that is how they presented themselves, as individuals protecting the mountains, monitoring illegal activity, preventing poaching, stopping unauthorized logging. And at first glance, that explanation seemed reasonable. The region had problems. The terrain was difficult to monitor, and groups like that could fill a gap. But almost immediately contradictions began to appear, because according to multiple independent sources, people from other NGOs, environmental groups, locals who had passed through the area, this group did not behave like ordinary volunteers. They had equipment that did not match their status. Drones, night vision devices, high-end cameras, all-terrain vehicles, dozens of licensed firearms. They moved through the mountains not like hikers, but like an organized unit. There were claims that they restricted access to areas around the hut, claiming it was protected territory, that they placed chains across roads, that they monitored movement, that they challenged strangers. Some confirmed this, others denied it, but one thing was consistent. No one could clearly explain who they were. But some people knew that at the center of the group was a man named Ivalo Kalashev. Kalashev had a presence, the kind that is difficult to define but easy to notice. Those who knew him described him as kind but driven, someone who did not move through life passively. He sought out environments that required control, endurance, and risk. Mountains, caves, deep water, places where the margin for error is small and where most people would hesitate to go. He embraced those spaces, and that lifestyle was his identity. But that was not his entire identity, because alongside the physical discipline, there was something else, a philosophical layer. Kalashev was deeply engaged with spiritual ideas, particularly those connected to Buddhism, not in a casual sense, not as a passing interest, but as something he studied, discussed, and attempted to live by. He wrote, he spoke, he was active in online forums. He gave lectures, some lasting hours, where he explored concepts of perception, control, suffering, purpose. There are recordings of him speaking to an audience. Unclear if these were his students, his followers, or if it was some random group he somehow managed to attract. Listening to these lectures, you can hear confidence but also calmness. However, the Bulgarian people are religious, conservative. They did not respond well to seeing ideologies different to theirs being expressed, but they were probably right in being conservative. Because what Kalashev was presenting did not always align with traditional teachings, even for Buddhists. There were elements that seemed altered, reinterpreted. According to people who had been close to the group, Kalashev was not just sharing ideas. He was shaping them, and gradually, he was shaping the people around him as well. He became a central figure in many people's lives. When people started looking beyond the surface, beyond the idea of rangers protecting nature, they found something that did not fully add up. The group was not just living in a hut. They were operating from it. It had become their base. And the way they presented themselves, both publicly and privately, began to raise concerns. According to people from other organizations, as well as individuals who had interacted with them over time, the group was persistent in its efforts to gain recognition. They contacted institutions, both Bulgarian as well as European. They pushed for legitimacy. At one point, they secured a form of cooperation with the Ministry of Environment and Water. It was not a formal authorization. It did not grant them official authority, but it gave them something almost as powerful: credibility, enough to present themselves as aligned with the state, enough to blur the line between real and fake. The organization had been established only a few years prior, around 2022, but within a short period of time, it had begun to expand its presence, creating additional entities, some of which were linked to broader European networks, at least in terms of naming and presentation. They even engaged with other branches of the state, such as the Ministry of Internal Affairs. According to official reports released by the ministry, the Petrohan Group had partaken in training activites alongside future police officers and other law enforcement personnel, something requested not by the Petrohan Group, but by the ministry itself. Perhaps this detailed somewhat offered an explanation how the group had acquired certain capabilities, how within a relatively short period, the group obtained licenses to over a dozen firearms. A process which is typically lengthy and involves multiple stages of verification. Yet one of the members, Ivalo Ivanov, obtained all of these licenses within a matter of a week, even though one of the firearms was supposedly going to be handed to a group member who was barely an adult at the time, just 19 years old. During the investigations of the 3 people who died in Petrohan, questions were being raised about how the group operated internally, about how decisions were made, about how influence was exercised, and about how much control Kalashev actually had over the group. Because while some described the structure as disciplined and purposeful, others described something else entirely. Influence that went beyond leadership. And this is where another word began to appear. A cult. It was not a universal opinion. Some rejected it completely. Others insisted on it. But it became part of the conversation. Because the more information surfaced, the harder it became to clearly define what the group actually was. Were they environmental volunteers? Were they an informal paramilitary-style unit? Were they a spiritual collective? Or something else entirely? And then another layer emerged. Because the group did not appear to be operating without support. There were sponsors, individuals with public visibility. These people who had visited the hut, had met the group, had seen how they lived. Among them were high-profile figures, including the mayor of Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria. According to his own public statements, he had financially supported the group. Significantly, tens, perhaps even hundreds of thousands were donated by him. He stated that he believed in their mission, that they were working to protect forests, to preserve wildlife, to do something positive in a region that needed it. He had met the people who would later be found dead. And according to him, there was nothing unusual, nothing criminal, nothing cult-like. Other supporters echoed that view. To them, the group was legitimate. But for the people outside that circle, doubt remained. Because the same group described as protectors by some was described very differently by others. The external image and its internal reality may not have fully aligned. Accounts circulated of confrontations with individuals passing through the area, including an incident in which a Border Patrol officer was reportedly asked not for his official credentials, but specifically for his personal identification, a detail that, whether isolated or not, added to the perception of unusual authority being exercised by the group. And this is where the role of other organizations became important. Independent groups, including environmental NGOs that had been active in the region long before the Petrohan Group appeared, began to speak publicly about what they knew and what they had seen. Some of these voices came from individuals who had direct experience with the area. Others from people who had examined the structure of the organization itself and had tracked the organization's attempts to push for legitimacy on a state level. They raised questions about the legitimacy of the group's claims, how their website contained stolen images from similar ranger websites from other parts of the world, about the origin of its resources, and about whether its activities were consistent with the role it claimed to perform. According to these outsiders, other NGOs active in the area were already doing a well enough job at preventing illegal activities and taking care of wildlife and the forest. In that regard, the Petrohan Group was deemed useless. By the time the 3 bodies were discovered outside the Petrohan Hut, the situation was already difficult to explain. What made it significantly more complicated was the fact that not everyone connected to the location had actually been accounted for. 3 more individuals who were known to be part of the group were still missing, and among them was Ivalo Kalashev himself. Soon attention shifted toward officially released footage of the final recorded movements at the hut, particularly the CCTV footage that had been released by authorities and circulated widely in the media. The initially released footage was not extensive, and it did not come immediately. In fact, most of it appeared later, after many of the key developments had already taken place, and instead of clarifying the situation, it introduced new questions. The absence of early visual information created a vacuum, and that vacuum was quickly filled by speculation. Even before any official reconstruction of events was presented, people began coming forward with their own accounts of what they had seen in the area in the hours and days surrounding the incident. Some of these accounts came from locals. Others came from relatives. Several described seeing vehicles moving toward the hut at unusual hours, black SUVs. Vehicles that did not match the profile of ordinary visitors in that kind of terrain, especially under winter conditions. The descriptions were consistent enough to draw attention. For some, this raised immediate concerns that what had happened at the hut might not have been internal at all, but the result of outside involvement. A hit, something organized. This idea was partially rejected when, later on, a small portion of CCTV footage was released showing a fork in the road. One path leading toward the hut and another leading away from it. In that footage, vehicles resembling those described by witnesses could be seen, but they were moving in the opposite direction, away from the location. That detail did not fully dismiss the theory of a hit, but it weakened the idea that those vehicles were directly involved in what had happened at the hut itself. At the same time, the lack of clarity only fueled further speculation. Within days of the discovery of the bodies, the mania around the Petrohan case had spread among the entire society. Television, podcasts, social media, radio. Every major outlet in the country was discussing it. People from all walks of life gave their opinions publicly. Journalists, former law enforcement officers, actors, businessmen, politicians. Everyone had a version. Everyone had a theory. Some focused on the internal dynamics of the group. The possibility of psychological breakdown, conflict, or control. Others looked outward, toward organized crime. One of the more widely discussed interpretations came from a member of a major political party who publicly stated in a podcast that he believed the hut itself may have been connected to criminal structures. He believed the location could have been operating under the influence of known figures from the Bulgarian underworld, including names that had long been associated with organized crime. In that context, the deaths were interpreted not as a suicide or internal conflict, but as a message, a demonstration, a way to show that interference would not be tolerated. This theory, like many others, was never confirmed. But it spread rapidly because it aligned with something people already understood about the region. Petrohan is not just remote. It is positioned close to borders. It's difficult to monitor. Historically used for movement that does not always appear in official records. In a place like that, the idea that something larger might be happening beneath the surface did not feel impossible. At the same time, other voices pushed back. Some pointed out that the individuals involved were known to each other, that there was no immediate evidence of an external attack, and that the available forensic details, limited as they were, did not clearly support the presence of outsiders at the scene. But the problem was not just the lack of evidence. It was the lack of clarity, because even the information that was available did not fit neatly into a single explanation. And as the debate intensified, another part of the timeline began to draw attention. The movements of the group in the hours before the fire. The early morning trip of Nikolai Zlatkov, one of the group's youngest members. His name would later come up during the search for the 3 missing group members. Nikolai would be seen on one of the cameras, loading up his truck at around 6 o'clock in the morning, departing for Sofia. He had been tasked with transporting back personal belongings of a girl who had recently been staying with the group, delivering them back to Sofia. Although Nikolai departed the hut alone, his vehicle would be later seen on CCTV returning without him behind the wheel. At some point along his route, he had left the car in a nearby village, after which it was retrieved and driven back to the hut by another member of the group. The reasons for this decision were never clearly explained. Later that same day, Ivilo Kalashev would depart the hut in his camper, accompanied by the group's newest and youngest member, Alexander Makulev. According to officials, they would later meet up with Nikolai somewhere along the way. It never became clear where that rendezvous would take place, and more importantly, why didn't they simply wait for Nikolai to come back to the hut before departing, but rather met somewhere in the middle? The 3 would then disappear only to be found in a different location, under circumstances that were just as difficult to explain as those at the hut. The investigation of the 3 dead bodies outside the hut quickly became a subject of controversy, not only because of what it showed, but also because of what was missing. According to official statements, the cameras that would have captured the exact area where the 3 bodies were found had been destroyed in the fire. At the same time, other cameras positioned around the hut remained intact and operational, including one located behind the building, which became one of the primary sources of visual information from the days leading up to the incident. This detail alone raised questions, especially among individuals who claimed to have visited the hut in the past. To everybody's surprise, these people claimed that the camera, which presented most of the investigation footage to the public, didn't really exist. The CCTV footage included in this video is from that exact camera. The recordings were provided to the public bit by bit as the investigation unraveled. The camera was supposedly positioned in the backyard of the hut. The camera shot wide angle. To the left-hand side, people could see the narrow road leading to the hut, which had a makeshift chain barrier tied to a tree. At the center of the footage was the hut itself. To the right-hand side were the garages where group members kept their vehicles. However, people who had visited the hut in the past and had spent time in that backyard stated no such camera existed in that location. While these claims were never formally confirmed, it contributed to a growing sense that the available footage was fake, generated by AI, or that somebody else was shooting those videos. In fact, one footage contained audio that creeped everyone out. In a brief moment, a quiet voice could be heard whispering, "Are you recording?" No official explanation of that audio was ever given to the public. Another one of the most discussed sequences showed the arrival of Ivalo Kalashev at the hut some days prior to the events. As his camper approached, the individuals waiting outside reacted in a way that many viewers found unusual. Rather than greeting Kalashev in a casual or familiar manner, the individuals appeared to briefly kneel and bow their heads to the ground. While this behavior could be interpreted in different ways, it was often cited as reinforcing the idea that Kalashev held a position of authority within the group that extended beyond ordinary leadership, and that this group was in fact a cult. Another piece of footage, released later and discussed heavily in the media, showed the three men who would eventually be found dead outside the hut interacting on the day of the incident. The clip was not fully clear, and the audio was only partially understandable, but fragments could reportedly be heard. Phrases such as, "It was an honor," and "we'll see each other." The men were also seen embracing each other, a moment that many viewers interpreted as a possible farewell. This footage became one of the reasons psychologists and commentators were invited onto television to analyze their behavior. Some argued that the embrace, combined with the tone of the audible fragments, could suggest that the men knew something final was about to happen. Others warned that the clip was too incomplete to draw firm conclusions from. Because the conversation was fragmented, the context was missing, and only pieces of individual sentences could be heard. Still, once the footage became public, it changed the way many people viewed the final hours at the hut. What had previously seemed like a chaotic sequence involving fire, gunshots, and confusion now also contained a quieter, more deliberate-looking moment. Three men standing together in the snow, embracing, and saying words that sounded, at least to many listeners, like goodbye. While the country was still trying to make sense of what had happened at the Petrohan Hut, attention gradually shifted toward the individuals who had left the mountain earlier that same day, because their movements introduced a second layer to the case that was just as difficult to explain as the first. Three people had departed from the hut that morning: Ivalo Kalashev, Nikolai Zlatkov, and a 15-year-old boy, Alexander Makulev. And for several days, there was no clear public information about their whereabouts, no confirmed sightings, and no consistent explanation from authorities about whether they were being actively searched for or where that search was focused. The absence of information became increasingly noticeable, especially given the scale of the case and the growing public attention. Because if the events at the hut were already unusual, The fact that 3 associated individuals had disappeared at the same time suggested that what had happened could not be isolated to a single location. As fragments of data began to surface, a broader movement pattern started to emerge, although not through official reconstruction, but through a combination of private camera footage, witness accounts, and later confirmations. Kalashev's camper had not remained near Petrohan. Instead, it had traveled across a significant portion of the country. At some point after leaving the hut, the vehicle moved southeast toward the village of Bulgaria, a remote settlement near the Black Sea and close to the Turkish border, an area known for its historical and cultural significance, including traditions such as the Nestinari, fire dancers who walk across burning embers as part of ritual practices. The group had a connection to that location, as they reportedly owned property there, which added another layer of complexity because it suggested that their activity was not limited to Petrohan, but extended across multiple regions of Bulgaria, including areas situated near key border zones. What remains unclear is the exact timing and purpose of that movement, and what, if anything, occurred during that period. At some point, the camper began moving back inland, back toward the mountainous regions of northwestern Bulgaria, eventually reaching an area near Okolkitsa Peak. Geographically, that peak is not too distant from Petrohan in the broader context of the country, but it is far enough to complicate any immediate connection between the two sites, especially when considering the lack of a clearly documented route between them. By the time the camper was located, it was not hidden, not damaged, and not abandoned in a way that suggested an attempt to conceal it. It was found parked in the woods, unlocked, and inside were the bodies of all 3 individuals, each positioned in a different part of the vehicle, in a way that immediately drew attention and later became central to the discussion around what had happened. One was located sitting behind the wheel, another near the door, and a third further inside, toward the rear of the camper. All 3 had gunshot wounds to the head, mirroring the pattern observed at the Petrohan Hut, which reinforced the idea that the 2 locations were directly connected, not separate incidents. Forensic analysis introduced details that only added to the uncertainty rather than resolving it. Gunpowder residue was found on the hands of some of the individuals, which suggested direct interaction with a firearm, but not on all of them, a distinction that became particularly significant in the case of the 15-year-old. The absence of such residue in his case raised immediate questions about his role in what had happened, because it indicated that he had not discharged a weapon, and therefore could not have been responsible for his own death in the same way that might be suggested for the others. Additional details about his position inside the vehicle contributed further to the unease surrounding the scene. Accounts described his hands as being held together, with fingers interlocked, in a position that some interpreted as resembling prayer or meditation. At the same time, attention returned to Kalashev's activity in the days leading up to these events, particularly his online presence and communication. On Facebook, he had posted content referencing Risto Botev, a central figure in Bulgarian history, known both as a poet and a revolutionary who died fighting for the country's independence, and whose writings often explore themes of sacrifice, purpose, and identity. These posts, when viewed after the fact, were interpreted by some as symbolic or reflective of Kalashev's mindset, particularly in relation to struggle and self-perception, although whether that interpretation holds any direct relevance to what happened remains uncertain. There were also messages sent to individuals close to him, including his mother, which were later reviewed by investigators, and which suggested that he was aware, at least to some extent, that something significant was about to unfold and perhaps wanted to warn people around him, or he was perhaps simply sending a farewell message. By this stage, the case had expanded beyond a single incident in the mountains near Petrohan and had become a multi-location event involving 6 individuals, 2 geographically connected sites, and a timeline that moved across the country in a way that was still not fully reconstructed. What had initially appeared to be a localized tragedy had now become something far more complex, involving movement, coordination, and a sequence of actions that did not fit easily into a single explanation. And as more details emerged, it became increasingly clear that understanding what had happened would require not just examining the final moments, but going back further into the structure of the group itself, their relationships, their history, and the environment in which they had been operating. By the time both locations had been identified, the Petrohan Hut and the site near Okolkitsa Peak, the case had already expanded beyond a single incident, but what followed did not bring clarity. Instead, the investigation introduced a series of details that, rather than forming a consistent picture, seemed to move in different directions at once. One of the earliest points of tension came from the physical evidence at the hut itself. The 3 bodies had been found outside the structure, positioned next to each other, each with gunshot wounds to the head. And from the beginning, authorities suggested that the deaths could be explained within the framework of a murder-suicide scenario. However, almost immediately, elements of that explanation were questioned, both in the media and by individuals familiar with the case. Among the details that drew the most attention was the number of shell casings reportedly found at the scene. 3 bodies had been discovered, but there were reports of 4 casings. It was discussed that one of the individuals may have had 2 gunshot wounds to the head, a detail that raised further questions about how such a sequence of events could occur if the act had been self-inflicted. While it is not impossible for multiple shots to be involved in a single case, the combination of these factors made the initial explanation difficult for many to accept without further clarification. Additional questions arose from the positioning of the wounds themselves, as it was suggested that the placement could imply the use of both hands, or at least a level of control that would be unusual in a self-inflicted scenario, particularly under stressful conditions. At the same time, attention turned to what had been found inside the hut. Although the structure had been heavily damaged by fire, it was not completely destroyed, and investigators were able to enter and examine parts of the interior. According to accounts that later appeared in the media, one area of the hut contained significant amounts of ammunition, some of which had been affected by the fire, leading to tiny explosions during the burning process. This detail was consistent with the sounds reported in footage from the scene, where bursts and sharp cracks could be heard alongside the fire itself. Another section of the hut, described in various reports, contained items associated with spiritual practice, images, objects, and materials connected to Buddhist symbolism. However, as this information began to circulate publicly, it was not received in a uniform way. Some interpreted it as confirmation of the group's spiritual orientation, reinforcing the theory of a cult. Others questioned it. Discussions in the media, including commentary from individuals presented as familiar with Buddhist traditions, suggested that some of the items did not clearly align with established forms of practice, leading to speculation that what was taking place there may have been a reinterpretation or a personalized version shaped by the group's internal dynamics, rather than a direct continuation of traditional teachings. This distinction became important because it fed directly into the broader question that had already begun to form. Perhaps these guys weren't rangers. Perhaps this was a structured spiritual group following a defined path, or something more closed, more controlled, and more internally defined. At the same time, the condition of the hut itself introduced further points of discussion. The fire had spread unevenly, and according to observations shared publicly, certain parts of the structure appeared to have been affected differently than others. While fire behavior can vary significantly depending on materials and airflow, the fact that some areas seemed more intact than expected, particularly those associated with the group's internal activities, became part of the wider conversation. Outside the hut, the environment provided its own clues. The ground had been covered in fresh snow, which would normally preserve tracks and movement patterns, but the combination of fire, debris, and subsequent activity made it difficult to establish a clear sequence of movement in the immediate aftermath. And throughout all of this, the public communication surrounding the case remained inconsistent. Press conferences were held, but often without detailed answers. Information was released, but not always in a structured or trustworthy way. Statements from different institutions, police, investigative bodies, and other authorities did not always align perfectly, which only contributed to the growing uncertainty. This lack of clarity did not remain confined to official channels. It spread outward, across media platforms, across the country. People were forming their own interpretations, not necessarily because they wanted to speculate, but because the available information did not fully explain what had happened. Some focused on the physical evidence, others on the behavior of the group, others still on the possibility that the answer might lie outside the group entirely. Perhaps these people were human traffickers or drug smugglers. And within that environment, even the individuals who first spoke about the scene became part of the narrative. The mayor of a nearby village, who had arrived at the location after the initial discovery, gave one of the earliest descriptions of what had been found, speaking openly about the condition of the bodies and the state of the hut. His statements circulated widely in the first days, partly because official communication was still limited, partly because he described details that had not yet been formally confirmed, and partly because he spoke about seeing people for national security, something he recognized easily, as he was supposedly previously involved in national security himself, an ex-agent from the dark era of communism. The involvement of national security had been noted early on, but never fully explained in a way that clarified whether their role was procedural, precautionary, or connected to something more specific. Speculation arose that perhaps someone in that group could have been an undercover agent operating within the group. But why? Were these people up there in the Petrohan Hut? Details alone were enough to keep speculation active. Because in cases like this, it is often not a single inconsistency that draws attention, but the accumulation of many small ones. Each detail, on its own, might be explainable, but together they resist simplicity. And as more of those details emerged, it became increasingly clear that understanding what had happened would require looking beyond the immediate events and into the structure of the group itself, their relationships, their history, and the environment in which they had been operating. However, the mayor was not the one who discovered the scene. That role belonged to one man, Delian Iliev, a former member, someone who had spent a long time with the group in the past, including periods abroad, and who remained close enough to still be in contact with Ivaylo Kalashev. In the hours leading up to the discovery, Delian had received a message from Kalashev. Its content was similar in tone to the one Kalashev had sent to his mother, a message that suggested urgency, finality, and the possibility that something was about to happen. That message raised concerns in DeLion's mind. He wanted to go to the Petrohan Hut immediately. But that night, reaching the hut was not simple. A heavy snowstorm had moved through the area, making access difficult, especially without the appropriate vehicle to navigate the terrain safely in the dark. So he waited. Early in the morning after, he set out toward the hut, taking his wife with him, a woman he had met during his time in Mexico, where he had previously lived and operated alongside members of the same group. As they approached the area, he made a decision. He told his wife to stay in the vehicle some distance away from the hut while he continued on foot. This moment was captured on one of the many cameras surrounding the area around the hut. From there, he moved alone through deep snow, making his way toward the hut with no clear indication of what he would find. The only protection he had was a small axe. As he reached the hut, the aftermath became visible. The Petrohan Hut had burned. Not completely destroyed, but heavily damaged. The surrounding snow, which should have been clean and undisturbed, was instead covered with debris, dark fragments, ash, and remnants of materials that had been thrown outward by the fire. DeLion's reaction in that moment was immediate and unfiltered. He could be heard breathing heavily, moving quickly. It was the reaction of someone realizing in real time that something had gone very wrong. Then he found the bodies. Shortly after, he contacted the authorities. What happened next, however, added another layer to the story. After speaking with police and providing the information he had, DeLion returned home. But not for long. He left shortly after, taking very little with him, never to be seen again. Accounts suggest that he left the country. This departure may have been connected to instructions received in that final message from Kalashev. Up to the point where he contacted authorities, individuals close to him stated that they had been in communication with him. After that, his presence faded from the story. And in a case already defined by unanswered questions, the disappearance of the person who first saw what had happened became one more detail that did not fully resolve. As the investigation was picking steam and attention shifted further away from the immediate scenes of the tragedy, more information began to emerge about the internal dynamics of the group, particularly from individuals who had once been part of it or had close contact with its members. Individuals spoke in detail about their experiences with the group. It was mostly friends of the deceased that came out. They talked about what they knew about the group and what they believed was the internal structure and goal of the group. Some spoke about how happy the people in the group were, how united they were. Some, though, spoke about how their now deceased friends would tell them, in the weeks prior to the events, about struggles within the group, about trouble on the horizon. It never became clear what these struggles were, or what that trouble suggested, but the result was apparent. One of the most striking and widely discussed appearances came from the mother of a former member of the group, who spoke at length in an interview published by an independent outlet. In that conversation, she described her own connection to Ivalo Kalashev and his circle, presenting herself not only as someone familiar with the group, but as someone who had actively supported it over time and who believed deeply in Kalashev's vision and mission in the world. According to her account, she had provided significant financial assistance, contributing to the resources that allowed the group to operate, both in Bulgaria and abroad. She spoke about her son's involvement with the group, describing how she had initially introduced him to Kalashev out of concern for his well-being, believing that the structured, disciplined environment would help him, because her son was a difficult teenager who had fallen victim of drugs and bad company. At the same time, the interview took a direction that many viewers found difficult to reconcile. She suggested that her own son bore responsibility for what had ultimately happened, implying that his behavior had contributed to the outcome, and presenting a version of events that shifted blame away from Kalashev and the group itself, but rather towards her own son. Her reasoning was simple. A few years prior to the events of February 2026, her son had gone to the police claiming that Ivaylo Kalashev and him had inappropriate relations during the time he was still a teenager. According to official accounts, the boy claimed that Kalashev was controlling and had sexual desires towards minors, as he had experienced himself firsthand. The claims made by the boy somehow reached Ivaylo Kalashev, and he confronted the boy. Soon afterwards, the son reached out to the family of another child that spent time with Kalashev and the group and advised them that perhaps something similar might have occurred with their child. The parents didn't take any action, but word reached the child's grandparents, who filed a claim against Kalashev, which was oddly retracted quite swiftly afterwards for no apparent reason. This claim had also somehow reached Kalashev. According to the mother, this was a turning point for Kalashev. She believed that he became upset from these supposedly false allegations, and this was what led to his end. The tone of the interview, combined with the nature of the claims, led to strong reactions. Some viewers interpreted her statements as an attempt to defend the group at all costs. Others questioned her credibility entirely, because alongside her account, another voice emerged. Her son, in a separate interview, also published by an independent outlet, he presented a markedly different version of events. He rejected the characterization of his behavior that his mother had described, stating that he did not have the problems she had attributed to him, and that his involvement with the group had been based on a different set of circumstances. According to his account, the internal environment was not simply structured or disciplined, but controlling. He spoke about the role of Kalashev not just as a leader, but as someone who exercised influence over members in ways that went beyond ordinary mentorship. The son spoke about his intimate relationship with Kalashev during the period in which he was living with the group. He also spoke about his experience speaking to the police about this inappropriate relationship, as well as his warnings to the other family. He claimed that the police basically laughed off his claims and never conducted any proper investigation into the case. In fact, not only did the police swipe everything under the rug, but according to him, word of these claims somehow reached Kalashev. But how and why did Kalashev receive information from the police when no official investigation took place? How and why was he informed? Perhaps he had friends in the police. Perhaps someone was looking out for him. But why? The statements made by the son were not part of any official finding and were not confirmed by the Ministry of Internal Affairs. But they were presented publicly in detail and became part of the broader conversation surrounding the case. When the head of national security was asked point blank if Ivaylo Kalashev or any of the Petrohan members were agents, no adequate answer was presented. It was never acknowledged, but also never denied. But going back to the interview of that son, now a 30-something-year-old man, there were further interesting details which he shared. He challenged the group's public image as protectors of nature and wildlife, the highlight of their public identity. He described incidents during their time abroad, particularly in Mexico, where the group had spent extended periods living and operating together. According to his account, their activities did not always align with the principles they claimed to represent. He referenced situations in which animals were harmed, including an incident involving a cave environment where wildlife was deliberately disturbed or killed contradicting the idea that the group adhered strictly to environmental preservation. This directly conflicted with other descriptions of the group, including claims made by supporters that they were so careful with nature that they would avoid harming even the smallest of creatures. The contrast between these two narratives, one describing restraint and respect, the other describing actions that suggested the opposite, became another point of tension in how the group was perceived. The time spent in Mexico itself became a subject of interest. The group had not only traveled there, but had established a presence, acquiring property and engaging in activities such as diving and cave exploration, sometimes presenting themselves as instructors or guides. They were not isolated from their surroundings, the way they were back in Petrohan. Accounts suggested that they interacted with locals, built connections, and operated in a way that allowed them to integrate into the environment rather than remain hidden within it. As the Mexico period was being discussed in the media, one particular story was brought to light. During the same general period of the group's life in Mexico, reports had surfaced of a Bulgarian national who had been found dead on a beach in Mexico, under circumstances that were never fully clarified. He was discovered with almost nothing on him apart from his phone, which immediately raised questions about what had happened in the time leading up to his death. No official information of that case was ever presented on Bulgarian news. The only outlets that ever reported this were foreign, Mexican, and Spanish. Information about the deceased man later emerged through a friend who spoke publicly in the media, describing him as someone who had chosen to leave his previous life behind in search of a different path abroad. According to that account, he had been in Mexico during a period that overlapped, at least partially, with the presence of Kalashev's group in the region. Geographically, the location where he was found was not identical to where the group had been operating, but it was within a range that made the overlap notable, particularly given the relative remoteness of some of these areas. No official connection between the cases was ever established. There was no confirmed interaction, no shared documentation, and no direct evidence linking the man to the Petrohan group. But the timing, the proximity, and the lack of clear explanation surrounding his death led some observers to question whether the two stories might intersect in ways that had not been fully explored. In the end, what emerged from all of these interviews was not a single, coherent narrative, but a set of overlapping and often conflicting perspectives. At the institutional level, communication was fragmented. Press briefings were held, but often without the level of detail that the public expected given the scale of the case. Different agencies appeared to operate within their own frameworks, and while information was released, it did not always form a complete or consistent narrative. At some point, multiple explanations had been proposed: that the deaths were the result of internal conflict, that they were connected to psychological breakdown, that they were influenced by ideology, belief systems, or group dynamics, that they were linked to external actors, organized crime, state structures, or something that had not yet been identified. Each theory addressed certain elements, but none accounted for everything. The two locations, the movement across the country to a third location, the inconsistencies in physical evidence, the conflicting testimonies, the delayed information, the unanswered procedural questions, and perhaps most importantly, the people themselves, who they were, what they believed, and what they were doing in the final days before everything came to an end. Not one single unanswered question, but a pattern of them. As the scale of the case became fully apparent and the amount of new information began to die down, public focus shifted once again, this time toward the families, the public response, and the way the investigation itself was being communicated. From the very beginning, friends and relatives of the victims appeared in the media, trying to shed light on what might have happened. But what stood out to many observers was not only what they said, but how they said it. Some of the parents spoke about Ivalo Kalashev in consistently positive terms, even after the circumstances of the death had become known, describing him as someone they trusted, someone who had guided their children, and someone they did not believe was capable of causing harm. This position remained largely unchanged even as allegations and conflicting accounts began to surface publicly, which created a visible contrast between the narrative emerging from former members and the perspective maintained by those closest to the victims. At the same time, there were appearances that introduced a very different tone. The mother of Nikolai Zlatkov, one of the group's youngest members. At just 22 years of age, he was among those later found in the camper. His mother appeared on national television during prime time on the very day that information about the discovery of her son, Kalashev, and a younger boy became public. She openly expressed distrust toward the authorities and suggested that the official version of events did not reflect what had actually happened. She spoke about the involvement of institutions, including law enforcement and national security, in a way that implied that key details were being withheld and that the situation was far more complex than it was being presented. During that appearance, she stated that she would not return to television again. But she did. In the weeks that followed, she continued to speak publicly, and in later appearances, she raised additional concerns, including the fact that the bodies of her son and the others had not yet been returned to their families, even after a significant period of time had passed since the autopsies. This issue became a focal point, because for many, it was not only a procedural matter, but a human one. Families were waiting, without closure, without access, without clear explanations. And in response, calls for accountability began to take shape, including discussions around organizing protests to demand greater transparency. As of the release of this video, no public information is available whether bodies have been finally returned to their mourning families. By the time the public attention began to fade, the case had already left behind a trail of contradictions that were never fully resolved, and perhaps more importantly, were not clearly explained in a way that allowed people to understand not just what had happened, but why it had happened. Because in the end, that is the question that remained. Not simply how 6 people died, but why. The official versions, to the extent that they were communicated, leaned toward explanations that suggested internal causes, scenarios in which the individuals themselves were responsible for the outcome, whether through conflict, psychological instability, or coordinated actions that ultimately led to their deaths. But even within that framework, the details never aligned cleanly. The physical evidence raised questions. The timelines raised questions. The number of shots. The number of shell casings. The positioning of the bodies. The separation into 2 locations. The presence of individuals who could not have participated in certain actions based on forensic findings. All of it made the idea of a simple explanation difficult to accept without hesitation. At the same time, one of the most difficult elements of the case to explain was the fire itself. The hut had been set ablaze, not accidentally, but in a way that suggested deliberate ignition, with flames spreading through the structure while ammunition stored inside began to react to the heat, producing the sounds that were later captured in footage and described by those who arrived at the scene. Footage from the hut also added another layer of difficulty in understanding what had happened. In one of the released recordings, taken while the structure was already burning, one of the victims could be seen outside, moving alongside the other 2 individuals. What drew particular attention in that moment was the condition of his clothing, as his pants appeared burned from the back, even though he was still mobile and moving within the scene. This detail raised immediate questions. At what point, relative to the fire, did the fatal event occur? If the events at the hut were the result of an internal decision, whether coordinated or otherwise, there was no clear reason to destroy the location in that way. Nothing illegal was officially reported as being discovered inside. No evidence that required elimination. No confirmed materials that would justify such an action. And that absence of motive made the fire itself one of the central mysteries. Because it was not just destruction, it was timing. It occurred in parallel with the deaths, which meant it was either part of the same sequence or something that overlapped with it. Inside the hut, another detail added to the complexity. The dogs. They were found inside the structure, dead, without visible external injuries. The most likely explanation, based on the condition of the scene, was that they had suffocated as the fire consumed the interior, trapped within the building as smoke filled the enclosed space. But that raised another question. If the individuals living there saw themselves as protectors of nature, as people who actively avoided harming even the smallest forms of life, why would the animals be left inside? Why would they be locked in without any attempt to release them? This detail, while small compared to the scale of the case, became one of the most emotionally difficult for many to reconcile because it contradicted the image that had been presented publicly. And then there was the positioning of the bodies themselves. They had been found outside the hut, placed next to each other, with gunshot wounds to the head. At first glance, this could suggest a coordinated act, a sequence carried out in a controlled manner. But the environment complicated that interpretation. The ground had been covered in snow from the storm that took place during the night. Fresh, deep, and later disturbed by fire debris, ash, and collapsing materials from the structure. This made it extremely difficult to reconstruct movement, to determine whether the individuals had been where they were found at the moment of death or whether they had been moved. Two possibilities were discussed: that they had been outside the entire time, positioned and acting in a coordinated way, or that they had been inside and later dragged out. Neither scenario could be confirmed definitively, and neither fully aligned with all the available details. Because if the act had been coordinated outside, it required a level of control and sequence that raised its own questions. And if the bodies had been moved, by whom? And under what conditions? The snow and debris did not provide clear answers. The fire had altered the environment, and by the time the scene was fully examined, the original state of the ground could no longer be reliably reconstructed, which meant that one of the most critical aspects of the case, the exact sequence of events at the hut, remained uncertain. If this was suicide, then why? Why would 6 individuals connected through shared experience, shared purpose, and in some cases deep personal trust, reach a point where such an outcome would occur, not in isolation, but across 2 different locations, in a sequence that required movement, coordination, and time? There were attempts to answer that question. Some looked at ideology, at belief systems, at the role of spiritual teachings, and whether they had been interpreted or transformed into something that could justify extreme decisions. There were even public discussions about whether such actions could be connected to Buddhism, whether such a framework could allow or explain what had happened. But even those discussions did not lead to clarity, because nothing in the available information clearly demonstrated that belief alone could account for the sequence of events that had taken place. At the same time, another question remained equally present. If this was not suicide, then who was responsible and why? Was it something internal that escalated beyond control? Was it external involvement? Organized crime? An encounter with something they were not meant to see? or something connected to the locations they operated in, places that sit along routes known, quietly but consistently, for activities that do not appear in official records. Each of these possibilities was discussed, repeated, analyzed, but none of them were confirmed in a way that closed the case. And that absence of closure became one of the defining characteristics of the entire story. Because despite the scale of the investigation, despite the number of institutions involved, and despite the intensity of public attention in the weeks and months that followed, the case did not end with a definitive explanation. It did not reach a point where all questions were answered. Instead, over time, it began to recede. Not because it was resolved, but because it was not. Because the complexity of the case, the lack of clear development, and the accumulation of conflicting information gradually pushed it out of the center of public focus, replaced by newer events, newer stories, and the constant movement of attention. And within that process, something else played a role. A familiar feeling. A sense, held by many, that the full picture had not been presented, that information had been withheld, that the version of events available to the public did not fully reflect what had actually happened. A sentiment that is not new and not unique to this case, but one that has existed across different moments in the country's recent history, shaping the way people interpret events when explanations feel incomplete. And so, for many, the case did not end. It remained, not in headlines, but in memory, as a story that had all the elements of something that should have been understood and yet never was. Perhaps, like many cases before it, it will remain unresolved, its details gradually fading from public discussion while the central questions stay exactly where they are. Perhaps the truth exists somewhere within the fragments that have already surfaced, waiting to be connected in a way that has not yet been done. Or perhaps the truth was never meant to be fully visible. Because in a case where so many elements overlap, where so many versions exist, and where so much remains unclear, it is difficult to ignore one final possibility: that what was seen was only part of the story, and that everything else remains just out of reach. This was the story of the Petrohan Hut tragedy. For more captivating stories, feel free to visit the channel and subscribe. Until then, good night and farewell.